On a bright, sunny morning in an upscale suburban neighborhood, the tranquility was interrupted by a routine patrol car slowly cruising down the street. Officer Carter, a seasoned law enforcement officer with a keen eye for details, had been assigned to this area for years. It was a peaceful community, one of manicured lawns and stately homes, where not much ever happened. But today, something caught his attention. He noticed a woman walking near a large, elegant property. She was carrying a small bag and appeared to be heading toward the front gate of the house. Her confident stride didn't deter him from wondering why she was there. In Officer Carter's experience, people who didn't fit the profile of the neighborhood often stood out. The woman, whose name was Erica, exuded an air of self-assurance. She was well-dressed in a crisp white shirt and tailored pants, her natural hair styled elegantly. She had an undeniable grace about her, but that didn't stop Officer Carter from feeling a need to investigate further. To him, something seemed off, not about her appearance, but about the scenario itself. Why was she walking into a gated home that, to his knowledge, had always been unoccupied whenever he passed by? The house belonged to someone wealthy, he assumed, but he didn't recall seeing this woman before. As Erica approached the gate, Carter's patrol car rolled to a stop nearby. Erica didn't seem to notice at first, her attention focused on the key fob in her hand. The sleek gates to the mansion slowly started to swing open as she pressed a button. That was when Carter decided to act. He stepped out of his vehicle, his polished shoes hitting the pavement with authority, and called out to her. His tone wasn't harsh, but there was an edge to it that immediately caught Erica's attention. She turned around, puzzled but not intimidated. "Excuse me, ma'am," Carter said as he walked closer, his hand resting lightly on his belt. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Erica raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the question. "I'm going into my house," she replied, her voice calm but firm. She gestured toward the now open gates, which revealed a sprawling driveway lined with trimmed hedges leading up to a stunning white mansion. Carter hesitated for a moment, unsure how to process her answer. His instincts told him to dig deeper. "Your house?" he asked, his skepticism thinly veiled. "Do you have any identification or proof of residence on you?" The question made Erica pause, not because she was unprepared, but because of the underlying assumption in his tone. She could tell he didn't believe her, and that realization stung more than she cared to admit. However, she maintained her composure. "Why do you need to see my identification?" she asked, her gaze steady. "I haven't done anything wrong." Carter felt the weight of her words, but his sense of duty overrode any second-guessing. "It's just a routine check," he replied, though even he could feel a hollowness in his explanation. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area, and I need to make sure everything is in order." Erica sighed, her patience beginning to wear thin. She reached into her bag, pulled out her wallet, and handed over her driver's license. Carter took it, his eyes scanning the name and address. The address matched the property, but he still wasn't convinced. He looked back at Erica, then at the house, and then back at her again. Something about the situation didn't add up in his mind, or maybe he didn't want it to. As the moments dragged on, the tension between them grew. Erica crossed her arms, watching as Carter's expression flickered between doubt and discomfort. She had encountered moments like this before, moments where she had to justify her presence in spaces where others assumed she didn't belong. But this time, standing in front of her own home, it felt particularly unjust. "Is there anything else you need, officer?" Erica finally asked, her tone sharp but controlled. "Because if not, I'd like to go inside my house now." Carter hesitated again, the weight of his assumptions pressing heavily on him. He handed her license back, but didn't move from his spot. Instead, he looked past her at the house, as if searching for some kind of confirmation that she was telling the truth. The sprawling mansion, with its pristine exterior and expansive grounds, seemed almost too grand for anyone to casually claim as their own, let alone someone like Erica, at least in his mind. The silence stretched, and Erica could feel the judgment in his gaze. She decided she'd had enough. Without another word, she turned and walked through the gates, leaving Carter standing there, conflicted and unsure. As the gates began to close behind her, he called out again. "Ma'am, wait," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. Erica stopped but didn't turn around. I need to confirm something." Erica spun on her heels, her frustration now evident. "What exactly do you need to confirm, officer?" "That a black woman can own a house like this. That I'm not here to steal or trespass, but to live my life in peace. Is that what you're struggling with?" Her words hit Carter harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss. For the first time, he questioned the instincts that had guided him throughout his career. Was he really protecting the neighborhood, or was he letting his biases cloud his judgment? Before he could say anything, Erica walked up to him, her head held high. "Next time, think twice before you assume," she said firmly. "And maybe, just maybe, you'll see people for who they really are." With that, she turned and disappeared behind the gates, leaving Carter standing there, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted the answers to. What had just happened, and why couldn't he shake the feeling that he had been wrong? As he got back into his patrol car, the weight of the moment lingered. He sat there for a few minutes, staring at the house and replaying the interaction in his head. Something about it didn't sit right, and he couldn't help but feel that there was more to Erica's story and to his own assumptions than he had realized. As Officer Carter sat in his patrol car, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this encounter wasn't as simple as it seemed. The address on Erica's license was legitimate, and yet something about the situation gnawed at him. He wasn't sure if it was his own misstep or an unease born from years of ingrained assumptions, but either way, he couldn't move on. The house, gleaming in the midday sun, seemed to taunt him with its silence. Its grandeur stood in stark contrast to the raw tension he'd just experienced at its gate. Who was Erica, really? And why did her presence challenge everything he thought he knew? Erica, meanwhile, had already entered her home. She leaned against the heavy oak door for a moment, inhaling deeply to calm the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Encounters like this weren't new to her, but that didn't make them any less exhausting. Being questioned in front of her own house, her sanctuary, felt like an invasion. It wasn't just about the officer's words, it was the way he looked at her, as if she were an outsider in her own life. She shook her head, trying to push the encounter out of her mind. She had too much to do and couldn't let this moment derail her day. The home's interior was as impressive as its exterior, sleek and modern, with warm touches that reflected Erica's personality. She'd worked hard to create a space that felt like hers, a place that represented not just her success but her journey. Every piece of furniture, every piece of art on the walls, told a story. The house wasn't just a house, it was a testament to years of perseverance, grit, and overcoming obstacles. Erica had built a life for herself that many people didn't see coming, and she was proud of it. But days like today reminded her of how much further society still had to go. She set her bag down on the marble kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water, trying to shake the tension from her shoulders. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was her best friend, Tasha, texting to confirm dinner plans later that evening. Erica smiled faintly. She'd tell Tasha about the officer later, knowing her friend would have plenty to say about the situation. For now, though, she wanted to focus on the work she'd brought home. There were contracts to review and meetings to prepare for, and she refused to let anyone, especially some skeptical officer, distract her from her goals. Back in the patrol car, Carter was still parked down the street, wrestling with his thoughts. His instincts, honed over years on the job, were telling him to drop it and move on. But a small voice in the back of his mind wouldn't let go of the encounter. Why had he felt the need to stop Erica in the first place? Was it really about the house looking empty for so long, or had something else driven his decision? The realization made him uncomfortable. He prided himself on being fair and just, someone who didn't let biases dictate his actions. But today, he wasn't so sure. He thought back to his early days on the force, when he'd been idealistic and eager to serve. He'd always believed in the badge, in the idea that it stood for something greater than himself. But over time, he'd seen how easy it was for assumptions to creep in, for routine stops to turn into something more. He didn't like the idea that he might be guilty of the same mistakes he'd criticized in others. Yet here he was, questioning a woman who had done nothing wrong, simply because her presence didn't align with what he thought he knew about this neighborhood. Carter decided he needed to know more, not because he doubted Erica, but because he doubted himself. He reached for his radio but hesitated. What would he even say? That he wanted to double-check someone's identity because she lived in a house that seemed too grand for her? No, he couldn't do that. Instead, he made a mental note to dig into the property records later, if only to ease his own mind. For now, though, he forced himself to put the car in gear and continue his patrol, even as his thoughts lingered on the interaction. Later that evening, Erica sat across from Tasha at a cozy downtown restaurant. The two women were like sisters, bonded by years of shared experiences and unwavering support for one another. Tasha listened intently as Erica recounted the incident with Officer Carter, her expression shifting from disbelief to outrage. "He really stopped you in front of your own house?" Tasha asked, her voice laced with indignation. "What did he think, that you broke into your own home?" Erica shrugged, swirling her wine glass thoughtfully. "I don't know what he thought, but it was clear he didn't believe I belonged there. You could see it in his face." Tasha shook her head, her curls bouncing with the movement. "That's ridiculous. You've worked too hard for this nonsense. It's like no matter how far we go, some people will always see us as out of place." Erica nodded, her friend's words resonating deeply. "It's frustrating, but it's not surprising. The house is just a symbol to them, you know. They see the mansion and think it belongs to someone who looks like them, not me. It's like my success doesn't fit their narrative." The conversation continued, moving between anger and reflection, as the two women discussed the broader implications of what had happened. For Erica, it wasn't just about this one encounter. It was about a lifetime of moments that had made her question her place in the world. But as the night went on, she felt her spirits lift. Tasha's unwavering support reminded her that she wasn't alone, and that her accomplishments were hers to claim, no matter who doubted her. Meanwhile, Officer Carter sat at his desk in the precinct, staring at the glowing screen of his computer. He'd pulled up the property records for the mansion and confirmed what Erica had already told him. She was the rightful owner. Seeing it in black and white made him feel both relieved and ashamed. Why had he doubted her? What was it about her that had triggered his suspicion? The questions haunted him, and he knew he couldn't ignore them any longer. As the hours ticked by, Carter found himself reflecting not just on Erica, but on his own experiences. He thought about the neighborhood he grew up in, where people who looked like Erica were few and far between. He thought about the training he'd received as an officer, the subtle ways it had taught him to view certain people as out of place. And he thought about the badge he wore, and whether he was truly living up to what it stood for. The night deepened, and the city outside the precinct grew quiet. Carter leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: he owed Erica an apology. Whether she accepted it or not, he needed to acknowledge his mistake. For the first time in a long time, Carter felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of change. The following morning, Erica woke up to a flood of emails and notifications. Her assistant had sent over a detailed itinerary for the day, packed with meetings and deadlines. Yet, as she scrolled through her phone, her thoughts kept drifting back to the encounter with Officer Carter. She wasn't the type to dwell on negativity, but this incident had struck a deeper nerve. It wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who faced the same assumptions, the same doubts, simply for existing in spaces where people thought they didn't belong. Erica knew she had a platform, and with it, a responsibility to do more than just move on. She tapped open her email app and started drafting a message to her legal team. asking them to look into potential partnerships with local advocacy groups. If this was still happening to her, even after all her accomplishments, she couldn't imagine the barriers others were facing. She paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the screen, and then hit send. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. Across town, Officer Carter was preparing for another day on patrol, but his mind wasn't on his duties. He'd spent the night replaying his interaction with Erica, trying to pinpoint the exact moment where he'd gone wrong. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about one mistake. It was about the mindset that had led him to make it in the first place, and that realization unsettled him more than anything else. At the precinct, Carter's partner, Officer Diaz, noticed his distracted demeanor. "You good?" Diaz asked as they loaded up their squad car. Carter hesitated before responding. "Yeah, just thinking about something that happened yesterday. You ever have one of those moments where you realize you might have been wrong, but it's too late to fix it?" Diaz raised an eyebrow. "What are we talking about here? Traffic stop gone sideways?" "Something like that," Carter muttered, reluctant to dive into the details. "I stopped someone yesterday, and I think I might have misjudged the situation." Diaz nodded knowingly. "It happens. We're human. But if it's bugging you this much, maybe it's worth revisiting. Sometimes a conversation can go a long way." Carter appreciated the advice, though he wasn't sure how to act on it. Reaching out to Erica felt daunting, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he owed her more than just an apology. He needed to understand why he'd made the assumptions he had, and what he could do to ensure it didn't happen again. Meanwhile, Erica was diving into her workday, but the memory of the encounter still lingered in the back of her mind. As she sat in a virtual meeting with her team, she found herself distracted by a question she couldn't quite answer. Was it worth addressing this publicly? She knew there would be risks. Speaking out could invite backlash, or worse, skepticism about her version of events. But staying silent didn't feel right either. After the meeting ended, Erica called Tasha, needing her friend's perspective. "Do you think I should say something about what happened yesterday?" Erica asked, pacing her living room. "Absolutely," Tasha replied without hesitation. "People need to hear this. You're in a position to make them listen. But," she added, her tone softening, "only if you feel ready. This kind of thing isn't easy to talk about, and you don't owe anyone your story if it's too much right now." Erica sighed. "It's not that I'm not ready. I just don't want it to become about me. This is bigger than one interaction." "Then make it about that," Tasha said. "Talk about the bigger picture. Use it as a way to shine a light on the systemic stuff. You're good at that." The conversation left Erica feeling more resolved. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she couldn't ignore what had happened. That evening, she sat down at her desk and began drafting a post for her social media accounts. It wasn't accusatory or angry, but it was honest. She described the encounter in plain terms, careful not to sensationalize, but also not to downplay the impact it had on her. By the time she hit post, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. At the precinct, Carter's day had been uneventful, giving him plenty of time to stew in his thoughts. During a quiet moment, he decided to look up Erica's name. What he found surprised him. Her social media post had already gone viral, with thousands of comments and shares. The reactions ranged from outrage to solidarity, with many praising her for speaking out. Carter felt a pang of guilt as he read through the responses. It was one thing to know he'd made a mistake. It was another to see the ripple effects of that mistake laid bare for the world to see. But as he read further, something else began to take shape, a sense of clarity. Erica's post wasn't just about him or their encounter. It was about a pattern, a systemic issue that went far beyond one officer and one stop. And while that realization didn't absolve him, it gave him a new perspective. Maybe there was a way to turn this into something constructive. Later that evening, Carter found himself outside Erica's gate once again, this time off duty. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if this was the right move, but eventually rang the intercom. Erica's voice came through, wary but polite. "Yes." "It's Officer Carter," he said, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "I was hoping we could talk." There was a pause, and then the gate clicked open. Carter walked up the driveway, feeling the weight of the moment with every step. When Erica opened the door, her expression was unreadable. "What can I do for you, officer?" she asked, her tone neutral. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Carter began, his voice earnest. "For how I treated you yesterday, and for the assumptions I made. I was wrong, and I know that. But I also know that an apology isn't enough." Erica crossed her arms, studying him. "What are you looking for, officer? Redemption?" "No," Carter said quickly. "I'm looking to understand. To do better. And maybe to figure out how I can be part of the solution instead of the problem." Erica regarded him for a long moment before stepping aside and gesturing for him to come in. "Let's talk," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. As Carter entered the house, he couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. But this time, he wasn't there to judge or question. He was there to listen, and as the two sat down to talk, it became clear that this conversation was just the beginning of a much larger journey for both of them. As Erica and Officer Carter sat in her living room, the atmosphere was charged with unspoken tension. The air felt heavy, and though Carter was there to listen, Erica wasn't sure how much she wanted to share. She had spent years building a life she was proud of, but moments like the one they had shared reminded her how fragile perceptions could be. For all her success, it only took a few seconds of misplaced judgment to make her feel invisible, like an outsider in her own world. Carter sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly as he leaned forward. "I know I can't undo what happened," he started, his voice low but sincere. "And I know you don't owe me anything. But if you're willing, I'd like to hear more about what it's like, being you, living in this world that clearly hasn't caught up to where it needs to be." Erica's first instinct was to laugh, not out of humor but out of disbelief. She wasn't sure if this was genuine, or if it was just another attempt to ease his own guilt. "What's it like?" she echoed, her voice steady but sharp. "It's exhausting. It's feeling like you always have to prove yourself, even when you shouldn't have to. It's walking into rooms and knowing people are making calculations about your worth before you've even said a word. And it's moments like yesterday that remind me it doesn't matter how much I accomplish, there are still people who see me as less." Carter flinched at her words, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He had seen it in her eyes the day before, that flicker of hurt she had tried to hide. And now, hearing it laid out so plainly, he couldn't ignore the weight of what he contributed to. "I'm sorry," he said again, but Erica shook her head. "Sorry doesn't fix it," she said. "And honestly, it's not about fixing this one moment. It's about fixing the system that allows moments like this to keep happening. Do you even understand how deep this goes? How many people don't get the chance to stand up for themselves because they don't have the platform or the resources?" Her words hit harder than Carter expected, and for a moment, he was at a loss for how to respond. But then he thought about all the times he'd brushed off similar complaints from others, convincing himself that they were exaggerating or looking for excuses. He thought about how easy it had been to fall into that mindset, to believe that his perspective was the only one that mattered. "I don't understand," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not fully, but I want to." Erica studied him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. She had heard these kinds of promises before, from people who wanted to make themselves feel better, but weren't willing to put in the work. But there was something in Carter's expression that gave her pause, a vulnerability that suggested he might actually mean it. "Wanting to isn't enough," she said. "You have to act. You have to be willing to challenge not just yourself but the people around you. That's the only way anything changes." Carter nodded slowly, her words sinking in. He knew she was right. Apologies and good intentions wouldn't change the way things were. But before he could respond, their conversation was interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Both of them froze, the sudden noise breaking the fragile sense of calm that had settled between them. "Are you expecting someone?" Carter asked, his voice tense. "No," Erica said, rising to her feet. She glanced out the window and saw a police cruiser parked outside. Her stomach tightened as she turned back to Carter. "Do you know them?" Carter stood as well, his brows furrowing as he moved toward the door. "Stay here," he said, his tone protective. He opened the door to find two officers standing on the porch, their expressions a mix of confusion and suspicion. "What's going on?" Carter asked, stepping outside to block their view of Erica. "We got a call about a suspicious person at this address," one of the officers said, his hand resting on his belt. "Who are you, and why are you here?" Carter felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice calm. "I'm off duty, and I'm here on personal business. There's no suspicious person here. This is the homeowner's property." The officers exchanged a look, clearly skeptical. "We'll need to confirm that," the other officer said, stepping forward. Carter held up a hand. "You don't need to do anything. I've already confirmed it for you. Unless you have a warrant or probable cause, you're not coming inside." Inside the house, Erica watched the exchange from the window, her heart racing. She couldn't believe this was happening again, so soon after the last incident. She felt a mix of anger and dread as she considered her options. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she also didn't want to hide. This was her home, and she had every right to stand her ground. Before she could decide what to do, Carter turned and gestured for her to come outside. She hesitated for a moment, but then straightened her shoulders and walked to the door. When she stepped onto the porch, the officer's eyes widened slightly, and she could see the judgment in their expressions before they even spoke. "Is this your house, ma'am?" one of them asked, his tone skeptical. "Yes, it is," Erica said firmly. "And unless you have a legitimate reason to be here, I suggest you leave." The officers looked at each other again, clearly uncertain how to proceed. Carter stepped in, his voice sharp. "You've got your answer. Now go." The tension was palpable as the officers finally backed down, muttering something about just doing their job as they returned to their cruiser. Erica watched them drive away, her fists clenched at her sides. She turned to Carter, her eyes blazing. "And you wonder why I'm so angry," she said. Carter didn't try to defend himself. He simply nodded, his jaw tight. "I get it," he said quietly. "I really do." But Erica wasn't sure if he truly did, and as the evening wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The encounter had brought everything to a boiling point, and she knew that something had to give. Whether it was in her control or not, a reckoning was coming. As the evening fell into a tense quiet, Erica couldn't shake the feeling that the officer's visit wasn't as random as it had seemed. Something about the way they looked at her, like they had already decided she didn't belong, gnawed at her. It wasn't the first time she faced this kind of scrutiny, but this time it felt more pointed, like it was personal. She tried to push the thought aside, chalking it up to her frustration with the day's events, but a nagging voice in the back of her mind wouldn't let it go. She decided to let it simmer for the night, hoping to clear her head in the morning. Meanwhile, Carter sat in his car just a block away, unable to leave. He told Erica he was heading home, but something kept him tethered to the neighborhood. Guilt? Maybe, but it felt like more than that, like he owed her something deeper than an apology. Her words had struck a nerve, and for the first time, he was seeing the world from a perspective he'd never fully considered. He couldn't stop replaying the moment on the porch, the look in the other officer's eyes, the way they questioned her right to be in her own home. He had spent his career upholding a system he now realized might be broken in ways he hadn't wanted to admit. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from a fellow officer, someone he'd worked with for years. "Heard about the call on Woodcrest. Everything good?" Carter hesitated before replying. "Yeah, just a misunderstanding." The response felt hollow, like a band-aid on a wound that needed stitches. But what else could he say? That the system they'd sworn to protect was flawed. That he was starting to question everything he thought he knew. No, that wasn't a conversation he was ready to have. Back at the house, Erica tried to settle in for the night. Sleep didn't come easily. Her mind raced with thoughts of what had happened, and what could have happened if Carter hadn't been there. The reality of how quickly things could escalate left her feeling vulnerable in a way she hated. She had worked too hard to let moments like these define her, but this wasn't something she could brush off. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought struck her. What if the officers weren't acting on instinct? What if someone had called them? The idea seemed absurd at first, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Her neighbors had always been polite but distant, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. She'd noticed the subtle glances when she first moved in, the way conversations would quiet when she walked by. It was nothing she could prove, but it was enough to plant the seed of doubt. And now, with everything that had happened, that doubt was growing into something she couldn't ignore. The next morning, Erica decided to take action. She pulled up the security footage from the cameras around her house, hoping to find something that would give her clarity. As the video loaded, she scanned through the footage from the previous day, her heart racing with anticipation. At first, everything seemed normal, just the usual comings and goings of the neighborhood. But then she saw it, a car she didn't recognize, parked just down the street from her house. The driver never got out, but they sat there for nearly an hour before the police arrived. Erica's chest tightened as she replayed the footage, trying to get a better look at the car. It wasn't one of her neighbors, she was sure of that. The windows were tinted, and the license plate was partially obscured, but something about it felt deliberate, like whoever was inside wanted to watch without being seen. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. She debated whether to call Carter. Part of her didn't want to involve him any further. He had done enough by standing up for her the day before. But she also knew that if she wanted answers, she couldn't do this alone. Against her better judgment, she picked up her phone and dialed his number. He answered on the first ring. "Erica," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "Is everything okay?" "I don't think so," she replied, her tone clipped. "I need you to come back. There's something I need to show you." Carter didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." When he arrived, Erica wasted no time. She led him to her laptop, where the footage was still playing on a loop. Carter leaned in, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. "You're sure you don't recognize the car?" he asked. "Positive," Erica said, "and I've lived here long enough to know it's not one of my neighbors." Carter nodded, his jaw tightening. "This isn't good," he said, more to himself than to her. "I'll run the plates, see if I can find anything." But Erica wasn't satisfied with waiting. "What if this is bigger than just a random call?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. "What if someone's trying to intimidate me?" Carter didn't have an answer. He didn't want to alarm her, but he couldn't deny that the timing was suspicious. As he left to follow up on the lead, Erica was left alone with her thoughts. The more she replayed the footage in her mind, the more certain she became that this wasn't a random incident. Someone had wanted to disrupt her life, to remind her that no matter how far she'd come, there were still those who didn't believe she belonged. But Erica wasn't the type to back down. If someone thought they could scare her into silence, they were sorely mistaken. She was determined to find out who was behind this, and why. What she didn't know was that the truth would be more shocking than she ever imagined, and it would test her in ways she never thought possible. The quiet life she had built for herself was about to be turned upside down, and the choices she would face in the days to come would change everything. Erica sat in her living room, the air heavy with the tension of the past few days. She hadn't slept much since discovering the strange car on the footage, and the waiting was starting to wear her down. Carter had promised to look into it, but the silence on his end was unsettling. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat, hoping it was him with answers. When his name finally appeared on her screen, she snatched the phone up immediately. "I've got something," Carter said, his voice low and serious. "But it's complicated." "What is it?" Erica asked, her grip tightening on the phone. "I ran the plates on the car," he began, pausing as though choosing his words carefully. The vehicle belongs to someone connected to one of my colleagues, an officer who's been vocal about certain beliefs. Erica's stomach dropped. What kind of beliefs? The kind that make him think he can decide who belongs in a neighborhood like this, Carter admitted, his voice tinged with anger. I can't prove he was the one in the car, but the connection is too strong to ignore. The weight of his words hung in the air. Erica didn't know whether to feel vindicated or terrified. She had suspected someone was targeting her, but hearing it confirmed made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. So what do we do now? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. I've already reported it to my captain, Carter said. But here's the thing. This officer has friends in high places. If we're going to push this, we need more than just speculation. We need proof. Erica nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we get proof. They decided to install additional security cameras around her property, ones with higher resolution and better angles. Carter promised to keep an eye on the situation from his end, but Erica could tell he was just as frustrated by the limitations of what he could do within the system. Days turned into a week, and while things seemed to quiet down, Erica couldn't shake the feeling that it was the calm before the storm. One evening, as she was reviewing the new footage, something caught her eye. A shadow moved along the edge of her property, just out of reach of the streetlights. Her pulse quickened as she zoomed in, trying to make out the figure. It wasn't the car this time. It was someone on foot, dressed in dark clothing, and moving with purpose. Erica's heart raced as she watched the person approach the side gate, pausing as if to assess the lock. Before they could go any further, the motion-activated lights in her yard flickered on, startling them. The figure bolted, disappearing into the shadows. She called Carter immediately, her voice shaking as she relayed what had happened. He arrived within minutes, his face set in a grim expression. This changes things, he said, reviewing the footage she had captured. If they were willing to come onto your property, they're getting bolder. We need to act fast. The two of them spent the next few hours going through the footage frame by frame, looking for any identifying details. Finally, they spotted something. A logo on the person's jacket, partially obscured, but just visible enough to recognize. It was the insignia of the local police department. Erica's breath caught in her throat. You're telling me this was one of your own? Carter looked at her, his face pale but determined. Not for long. The revelation was a gut punch, but it also gave them the leverage they needed. Armed with the footage, Carter took the evidence to his captain, who, to his credit, acted swiftly. The officer in question was suspended pending an investigation, and word quickly spread through the department. Carter knew he had made enemies by coming forward, but he didn't care. He had crossed a line of no return, and he was determined to see it through. For Erica, the ordeal was far from over. While the immediate threat had been neutralized, the scars left behind were not so easily healed. She had always known the challenges of being a black woman in spaces where people didn't think she belonged, but this experience had taken that awareness to a new level. Still, she refused to let it define her. If anything, it had strengthened her resolve to stand her ground, no matter the odds. As time went on, life in the neighborhood began to return to normal. The street that had once felt like a battleground now felt like home again, filled with the laughter of children and the comforting hum of daily life. Erica's house, once the target of suspicion and hostility, became a symbol of resilience and hope. She often found herself reflecting on how far she had come, not just in terms of the investigation, but in her own personal journey. She had learned to trust her instincts, to lean on others when needed, and to never back down in the face of injustice. One sunny afternoon, as Erica was tending to her garden, Carter stopped by. He had taken to visiting her every now and then, partly to check in and partly because their shared experiences had forged a deep bond between them. He leaned against the fence, watching as she carefully watered her plants. You know, he said with a smile, this place looks a lot more peaceful than the first time I came here. Erica laughed, shaking her head. That feels like a lifetime ago. It does, Carter agreed. But I think what you did here will have a ripple effect. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for a lot of people. Erica set down her watering can and looked at him. I couldn't have done it without you, Carter. You took a risk too. Don't think I've forgotten that. He shrugged modestly. It was the right thing to do. Besides, I had a pretty great example to follow. They both fell silent for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through hanging in the air. But it wasn't a heavy silence. It was one filled with mutual respect and gratitude. As Carter left, Erica sat on her porch, taking in the view of her quiet, tree-lined street. The scars from the ordeal were still there, but they were beginning to fade. In their place was a newfound sense of purpose and a deeper appreciation for the community that had stood by her side. She knew there would always be challenges ahead, but she also knew she was capable of facing them. The story of Erica's battle and victory became a source of inspiration for many, both within her neighborhood and beyond. It was a reminder that change often starts with one person, one moment of courage, and one decision to say enough. And as Erica sat on her porch that afternoon, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just in what she had accomplished, but in the person she had become.